Hi everyone, and welcome to the May instalment of our Breakfast Briefing series. For those who I've not met yet, or you may have not met Seismic yet, it's excellent to have you joining us. My name is Olivia Jennings, and I'm a sustainability consultant here at Seismic. And Seismic are an international team of sustainability experts, and we're on a mission to help businesses like yours prosper by becoming increasingly impactful and influential forces for good. Our team brings together experts on B Corp, advisors on net zero, who you're going to be hearing from today, communications consultants and sustainability strategists to help businesses lead the shift we need to make from shareholder primacy towards prioritizing all stakeholders. So if you are new to the Seismic community, here's a sample of businesses that we've been very fortunate to have worked with to reach their sustainability ambitions. And you'll see that, this spans a range of sizes and sectors, B2B, B2C, tech, and otherwise. And it also includes our guests who we feel really fortunate to have joining us today from Newcore Capital, HG&Co and Kerv, and we will be doing a proper introduction of them a little bit later. But first, here's an agenda for the session today. So we're going to be kicking off with carbon footprinting how-to for scope 1, 2 and 3. Then be looking at how net zero and carbon ties into B Corp for those of you on your B Corp journey. Then be sharing some top tips to get started on your carbon journey, and inviting our guests for a panel discussion to get their practical advice based on their experience. And at the end, there'll be time for a Q&A from those in the audience. So if you do have questions as you go, we encourage you to make a note of them, put them in the chat, and then we will come to them at the end of the session in the Q&A. I'm now delighted to hand over to our speakers, my colleagues Inga and Joe. Inga Herzog is our Head of Service Excellence here at Seismic. She has 10 years experience in supporting businesses to measure and reduce their carbon footprint and also build their wider sustainability strategies. And so it's great at looking not only at your carbon footprint, but also how that fits into your wider business ambitions. And Joe Venables is a senior sustainability consultant here at Seismic with over 5 years experience working both in-house as an analyst and with us at Seismic as a consultant. He has an incredible knowledge and experience of carbon footprinting in tandem with a talent to make the complex simple. So hopefully together, as an outcome of today, you will have all your questions around carbon demystified and feel inspired and energized to embark on the next steps of the carbon journey at your business. So over to you, Joe and Inga.
Thanks very much for your kind words, Olivia. And lovely to see all of your faces here today. With the first part of this, I just want to describe an organization's kind of typical net zero journey. This can come in slightly different orders, but this is a sort of general approach for how we recommend companies tackle things. And we'll go into each of these in a bit more detail. So first of all, it's really important to measure. So measure your carbon footprint across scopes 1 to 3. This will give you a complete carbon understanding of your business and also help identify where those emission hotspots are for reduction. And then this piece of work feeds onto really a net zero pathway and action plan. So based on your organizational carbon footprint with its hotspots, basically understanding which levers you can pull as a business to reduce those emissions. And we always recommend, having those kind of conceptual reductions backed up by a clear action plan to kind of try and make things as kind of paint by numbers as possible. We'll touch on that a bit as well. And then really onto the submitting a net zero target. So there's a few different options or flavors depending on, you know, your level of ambition and your size of a business. So yeah, we just want to touch on those as well. So yeah, as I said, this is the sort of general approach, but yeah, these pieces can be moved around, but typically we get most traction by doing it this way. Anyway, starting off on a scope 1 to 3 carbon footprint. And basically by that, I mean all direct and indirect carbon emissions associated with an organization's value chain. And significantly, those emissions should be within an organization's operational control. So what I mean there is within your operational control, you have an ability to influence and drive reduction within those emissions. So as a whistle-stop tour, any scope 1 emissions cover your direct emission releases. That's you as a business directly releasing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. That's typically through sort of heating within buildings or fleets of vehicles, and it can also cover refrigerant top up as well. Onto scope 2, that's basically just electricity consumption. So while you are responsible for burning it, the actual emission release happens off-site. So yeah, that's basically electricity consumption, and that can cover, you know, renewable and non-renewable energy there. And then really the really challenging and significant chunk of most organizations' footprint is really those scope 3 emissions. You know, based on our experience, you know, they can be, you know, typically about 90 to 95% of an organization's total footprint. So it's a sort of potentially a big challenging chunk, but I like to sort of flip that thinking to be actually it's a really big chance for opportunity for reduction there. But yeah, your scope 3 covers everything from your business travel, employee commuting, working from home, as well as purchase goods and services and kind of any transportation and distribution. So yeah, really with your scope 1 to 3, it's about understanding which of these emission sources are relevant and what data you've got available and coming up with a robust structure for collecting and reporting that data in a like-for-like means. So yeah, that was all on scope 1 to 3. And next, I just want to give you an illustrative example of an organization's net zero pathway and an action plan. Well, it's just the pathway actually, but really here, what you can see in this figure is a sort of overview of the whole approach. So the kind of teal line, the teal horizontal line is basically your organization's footprint if there are absolutely no changes to your business as usual activities. Within your pathway, you need to understand what levers you can pull to reduce impact, and typically they come in the areas of reduced activity saving. So that's, you know, reduced distance traveled, reduced energy consumption, etc. And the second lever there really is reducing emission intensity. So switching to alternative products or services with a lower carbon intensity, or changing in use altogether. So those are really the levers you can pull in a net zero pathway. And the one other thing you really need to consider as all part of this is business growth. So, you know, as you go along your target window, typically businesses is expected to grow, and the growth and projected emission impact of that growth should be accounted for in your pathway, because otherwise, you know, you could get to 2025 and realize that you know, our emissions are still going up drastically. So yeah, that's a sort of brief introduction to the pathway and action plan. And now I really just want to, you know, just talk openly about the different types of target option which are available to you. And these are really the kind of official target options. So starting off on the lowest ambition, we talk about carbon neutrality. And what that entails is measuring all of your organization's footprint annually, making carbon reductions every year where possible, and neutralizing those residual emissions with high quality offsets. So that's one sort of valid carbon target option. But I guess the point with that is you're not necessarily making any active steps to reduce emissions in line with climate science. Ramping up our ambitions slightly, we're moving on to a near-term small medium enterprise science-based target, and this is applicable for all organizations with less than 500 full-time employees. And your requirements here are, again, measure your footprint annually and commit to an emission reductions target for 2030. And there's some nuance here, but the headline figures here really are a 50% scope 1 and 2 reduction and no absolute scope 3 emission growth. So, you know, that scope 3 piece can be challenging, particularly when you've got very strong growth ambitions. So then every year we need to reduce and report our organizational windows over the target window, and then you're encouraged to offset those, you know, residual emissions when the target year is achieved. There's nothing wrong with offsetting your emissions as you go, but that CapEx could maybe better be spent internally on carbon reduction initiatives. So yeah, moving on to a just near-term science-based target. So this applies to organizations larger than 500 employees, and it's slightly more ambitious. So within this, you're looking to approximately a 50% reduction in scope 1 to 3 emissions over the same target window. But yeah, both of these target types are really about tackling emission reduction in the near term. And then finally onto the kind of gold standard of net zero targets. So this is published by the Science Based Target Initiative, and this long-term target option is effectively a bolt-on to those near-term targets. And within this, you're committed to a 90% reduction in scope 1 to 3 emissions, irrespective of your company size by 2050. And yeah, this is really the gold standard option for organizations out there. So yeah, that was a brief overview of the kind of different sort of validated target options which are available. And yeah, we basically encourage companies to be as ambitious as possible while maintaining sort of pragmatism throughout. So yeah, I just want to pass over to Inga, who will just discuss how B Corp and net zero tie together.
Thank you very much, Joe. So really interesting for our community how we can bring these threads together of the B Corp and the net zero efforts. So first of all, depending on your business activities, your net zero will make up about 20% or more of your BIA. And that includes all of the air and climate section, part of the environmental management section, part of the water, part of the land and life. And although environmental management, water, land and life might not seem directly linked to net zero, this is all part of linking, of monitoring and managing, tackling your environmental impacts, which absolutely does feed in. So it's all supporting to the same goal. The questions that are covered under these sorts of in the BIA include percentage of products with life cycle footprint and assessments, monitoring of energy consumption, monitoring of greenhouse gas emissions, what your total scope 3 footprint is, supply chain greenhouse gas management, and supply chain greenhouse gas monitoring and improvement of that footprint. On the next slide, we know that although that there are currently new standards in development by B Lab, which are due to be launched at the end of, towards the end of next year, 2024. So B Lab are currently actively collecting feedback from the community, But the proposed standards look to include on climate, that B Corps take climate action in accordance with science. And secondly, on environmental management, that B Corps have an environmental management system in place that demonstrates their commitment to reducing their footprint. As I said, these aren't confirmed yet, and B Lab is currently taking feedback from the community, but it does show that these elements are becoming must-have for the B Corp community. And we expect to see more requirements on the horizon from B Lab in the coming years. So net zero is definitely the way to go. And Tabby's kindly shared a link there about those performance requirements. Next, we're going to wrap up our content by sharing practical next steps and top tips before we move on to our panel discussion. So firstly, top tips, start with the end in mind. That will help you to not spend disproportionate amount of time and effort measuring areas that are not material. Joe is a big advocate of this, beginning with the end in mind. What's your most material impacts and prioritizing those? Secondly, bring people with you. Carbon is as much about people as it is about data. It's about engaging the internal team, the supply chain, those data owners, really key to being able to pull the picture together. And thirdly, building your carbon journey into your broader sustainability strategy, or even better, merging them as the B Corp framework enables you to do. And as we can see the direction of travel increasingly, it just makes business sense to have these things tied together well. Over to you for next.
Thanks. Thanks, Inga. Sorry, just mute button. So yeah, just as practical next steps, which your company can do now is start measuring your scope 1 to 3 footprint. And based on that footprint, develop an action plan covering all of your scopes, as we've alluded to, focusing on those big hitters, those material emission sources, and then sign up to the B Corp Climate Collective to join with your peers and really commit to that ambition.
Thank you, Joe. So next, we're going to hear from our panel, partners of Seismic, whose carbon data is feeding into their wider ESG and B Corp journeys. So first of all, we are going to hear from Kate Sandle, the Director of Sustainability at Newcore Capital. Newcore Capital is a B Corp certified investor specializing in social infrastructure real estate. And that means that Newcore invests in assets that are integral to society's needs. Kate worked previously with B Lab UK for over 6 years and is a co-founder of the Business Declares Coalition. So it's a real honor to have Kate speaking with us, and Newcore are currently partnering with Seismic to measure their scope 1, 2, and 3 footprint and to set a robust net zero target. We are also joined by Francis Thomas, the Chief Sustainability Officer at Kerv. Kerv is a tech services provider employing over 600 people worldwide, and Kerv's mission is to use the power of technology for good. Francis has over 20 years of experience in the tech sector. He's incredibly passionate about using business as a force for good and is leading the development of Kerv's business sustainability strategy, which includes working towards B Corp certification and measuring and managing their environmental footprint. Kerv is currently partnering with Seismic to support those goals. And finally, we are also joined by Liz Lown, who's the Operations Director at HG&Co. HG&Co is a forward-thinking, forward-looking, sustainable, independent family business that manufactures Hayman's Gin and co-manufactures other alcohol brands as well, and also produces ethanol for industrial purposes. Liz works in the business to ensure that everything runs smoothly and is responsible for HG&Co's environmental data processes. HG&Co are currently partnering with Seismic to develop robust processes for collecting their scope 1, 2, and 3 data, and tracking their target progress for mandatory reporting for their EMS purposes and other mandatory pieces that they are complying with. So as we open up this panel discussion, please, can I encourage everyone to go ahead and drop any questions you have in the Q&A, keep those coming, and let's dive in. Good morning, Liz, Kate, and Francis. Thank you very much for joining us. To begin, could you please tell us briefly about your company's net zero aspirations and journey to date? Francis, let's start with yours.
Good morning, everybody. So we've been trying to manage our environmental impact for about 12 months. We're, as a business, only 2 years old. And so far, we have introduced 14,001, which has been instrumental to having the sort of changes we want to make. We're in our second year of emissions measurement, and we're beginning to work through our reduction strategy. I think, as Joe mentioned before, that's for us all about our supply chain, with 96% of our emissions in purchased goods and services. And we're also working really hard to introduce emissions reporting as on an MI data for emissions reporting on a monthly basis.
Thank you, Francis. And Kate, could you tell us briefly about your company's net zero aspirations and journey to date?
Yes, so Newcore is a real estate investment manager, so works primarily with buildings, which are in our scope 3. But we have a very small scope 1 and 2, so we have been measuring that and being kind of climate neutral for the last couple of years, which means kind of triple offsetting our very, very tiny amount of emissions that we create as a result of existing for our primary focus. But our scope 3 is our biggest problem, and we'll dive into that a little bit more. But getting actual data, being able to use that rather than benchmark data due to the kind of the nuances of how we invest in assets and the type of assets we invest in has been really tricky. So yeah, that's where we are.
Yeah, certainly a tough topic. I look forward to diving into that, the challenge of collecting reliable, robust data. Liz, could you share with us what is your company's key carbon priority right now, and how did you decide what that priority might be?
So we're a manufacturing organisation with more than one site, so slightly different to other companies. We've had some environmental aspirations previously, we've got some basics in place, but we hadn't really joined it all together. And when we started down our B Corp journey, that's one of the reasons for doing that, was to pull us together. So we've been focusing mostly on our direct manufacturing side of the business. We've been focusing very much on eliminating gas from site and using it in its various forms, which has really helped us. We've been focusing on our scope 1 and 2 predominantly to get us started. And the other side of things we've been focusing on is minimising waste and avoiding landfill, obviously. And as part of that, that's helping us with our B Corp submission and how we meet our targets in our environmental management system. But we're also taking a holistic approach. So we're not just focusing on those aspects, we're also focusing on the products that we make, the components that we're using to make those products, how we can use sustainable and more recyclable elements in the products that we manufacture as well, and how we work with our suppliers to do that and move forward.
Thank you. What a wonderfully holistic approach you are taking. You've mentioned there, Liz, how the data journey feeds into your EMS, and I'd actually like to hear about more instances of environmental focuses tying together. So particularly about how B Corp and net zero comes together. Kate, at Newcore Capital, you've been a certified B Corp since 2020, I believe. How has being a B Corp affected the net zero journey, if at all, so far?
So Newcore Capital, pre-existing my time, but I met with them when I was at B Lab, had been thinking about this, but more from a social perspective, because the type of assets that we invest in is very much more social. So the environment wasn't prioritised probably as much as it could have been. And they certified as B Corp with a very low environmental score, which you can do, potentially not in the future. And so part of recertification, which is happening this year, is making sure we obviously increase that. But I think our main drivers for taking environmental action haven't necessarily been woven or interwoven with the B Corp ambition. I mean, yes, there's an element of being a responsible business that was probably inherent in the business anyway, and so you take that holistic approach when you're thinking about embracing what it looks like to embed kind of all of your stakeholders in your decision making. But we also submit to the kind of the real estate B Corp, which is GRESB, and that has very much focused our attentions on our environmental action, because it's far more directed at real estate and therefore quite specific. And the beauty and challenge of B Corp is obviously it's for every sector, every size, every location.
Thank you very much. And a really good point about how the performance requirements that we expect to come in towards the end of next year is going to make it mandatory that these two pieces really become merged. Thank you. And Frances, how about for Kerv? To what extent is your B Corp journey and your net zero journey coming together?
Sort of late stage. We went down the path of trying to manage our emissions before we decided we were going to try and become a B Corp. And I think if you're following a framework, so we've decided to submit a science-based target, and we've been working hard with Seismic to identify exactly what that glide path looks like. If you're doing those things, then answering sort of well within the B Corp is pretty straightforward currently. As you said, Inga, that might get harder when we come to sort of a CI stage, because we're pre-submission. We're about to submit our application, so to speak. And I don't think it's really changed anything we're doing, but it has allowed us to score well in that section, if we're honest about it.
Well, it's good credit where it's due. It's also very good practice that you had already begun on your carbon journey and had the benefit of having put that work in up front as you came around to completing your B Corp B impact assessment. And Frances, I wonder if you could tell us more about how the net zero target setting process has been for Kerv, noting that Kerv is growing very rapidly in the recent years, and that's set to continue.
Yeah.
How is business growth factored in?
So when we first started on that process, we thought to ourselves, well, we can reduce this intensity quite readily. We sort of know what to do. And it wasn't until sort of Joe came back and played to us our historical growth figures, bearing in mind we're only a couple of years old, but the projected growth figures, that we sort of realized how much of a problem we had. And, you know, Joe did mention to us one of the things we could start doing is just stop growing, which we decided probably wasn't an option. But, you know, it is an option. So I think the result of that is that you've got to be quite brave with the decision-making process. I think firstly, start as soon as you possibly can. And then some of the commitments we are having to make, and I don't propose we have managed to deliver these yet, are things like, you know, no new emissions for any new products, services, or partnerships. That's the number one thing that we're trying to do this year. We're quite an acquisitive business as well, so increased environmental assessment pre-M&A, and genuinely using that as part of our process to say, hey, this does have an impact on that ambition, and the business being grown up enough to realize that that's part of that decision-making process. I think much closer scrutiny of the people that we work with, not necessarily abandoning those suppliers that are pretty rubbish from an environmental performance perspective, but certainly having a long, hard look at those that aren't willing to go on a journey with us. You know, thankfully that we found quite a lot of our suppliers do have SBTs, because we work with good businesses. But I said none of them are simple, and they're all require investment. They all require a change, and I think we're at the stage where that's starting to hit home for our business now. You know, we're starting to get some traction, but they're not easy things to do. I guess that's the reason why you know, more businesses aren't doing more of it more quickly.
Can I just jump in there, because we also looked at SBTIs, but because we're investment manager, it was quite difficult for us. And again, that discussion, which no one wants to have about degrowth with any kind of ambitions, especially if you're doing a really good thing, you know, that isn't necessarily an option. And we have decided to move away from SBTIs, but look at aligning with 1.5 degrees, and from a real estate perspective, using a CREM pathway. But I think that's the biggest challenge that I didn't realise was the kind of the absolute reduction, and that doesn't necessarily align with any business with the growth ambition, unless you're kind of already pretty established and you know that you haven't been focusing on this for a long time. So I think that is a bit of a tension. And the other thing maybe on reduction from that perspective, before we engaged in our kind of real climate journey, we moved office. So we massively reduced, we were in a really kind of old, cranky office, and moved to kind of a BREEAM excellent office, which massively reduced our thing, and our baseline is with that data included. So it also, you know, when you choose your baseline and what you're doing is also quite a consideration, because you might have already massively reduced as much as possible, which we've done with our office and our immediate surroundings. But yeah, so I think that's quite an important consideration when people are thinking about this.
Thank you for sharing that, Kate. And Liz, I know that at HG&Co baselining is something that you've also been doing recently. Could you share with us more about that and how that's fed into your target setting process? Oh, you're on mute.
So Joe and his Excel spreadsheets have been helping us with this, and he's been helping us collect well, we've been collecting the base data, and he's helping us with how we format that and put it in a format that gives us clarity on where elements of our carbon footprint are coming from and where we might want to prioritise ourselves. And that's really given us a good understanding of our current state and what we want to do next. That's also helped us set our targets. So we've tried very hard to do stretching but achievable targets. We've not been as brave about the science-based targets at this stage. Being a manufacturing element to our business makes it slightly more challenging. We'll hopefully get there one day, but we're starting with intensity-based targets at this stage. And obviously we're doing all of that to align. We've submitted to B Corp, we're in the verification stage at the moment. And so we've made sure all our targets align with what we're doing with our submission.
Thank you, Liz. Joe, I wonder whether you could just share with us, just for clarity for everyone, the difference between absolute and intensity targets, and your advice on this topic we've been discussing, how to factor growth and the challenge of growth into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, an absolute target is effectively you release, you know, say 100 tons of carbon, and you need to absolutely reduce that. So you know, 90 tons the next year, 80 tons the subsequent year, and thereafter. Whereas an intensity target is basically tied to either a physical unit, so that could be number of FTEs, floor area for a property company, or you know, liters of product produced in HG&Co's case, and you're basically reducing your emissions relative to the amount of stuff or people there. Now both of these options are acceptable in the science-based target framework, but yeah, really with the intensity target, you have to be slightly more ambitious with your percentage reduction, and B, you are tied to that consideration of no absolute emission growth.
Thank you, Joe. And if anyone has any further questions getting into that, please do drop them in the comments area. We can pick them up in the Q&A. Kate, I wanted to hear from you. What's been the biggest challenge that you've had to overcome so far in advance of your net zero journey, given what you've shared with us as well?
Yeah, well, I suppose there's two challenges, and the first one isn't necessarily a challenge, but is around something that you mentioned earlier about bringing people with you. I think at the root of all of this, and actually they're probably linked between the B Corp assessment and net zero, is around governance. So you need to get the intention, get the buy-in from the people in your organisation, and I think it has to come from lots of different levels, and it depends who you are in the organisation and who is the stakeholder that needs to kind of support the transition that needs to happen. But you either need to kind of we didn't necessarily have this problem, but the CEO or the lead people need to be willing and aware of what this means in setting a net zero target, because it means change for an organisation, but it also means you have to take everyone with you on that journey. So that would be the biggest challenge. We're lucky our CEO is totally bought in. But the other thing that I mentioned earlier was all of our emissions essentially are in scope 3, and because we're a real estate investment manager, all of our emissions for scope 3, not all, but a large amount of them are in the assets that we own. And the setup that we have, which is an FRI lease, which means that the tenant is totally in control of that asset, probably for around 25 years, means our control is close to nothing. So tenant engagement, or you can call it supplier engagement, is absolutely fundamental. And for us, getting that baseline data, which means looking at data collection services and things like that, to get to that point, and to make sure you have an accurate baseline, because you need to ensure that's the best way of engaging.
Really important. And you've mentioned the collaboration piece there again, how important it is to bring people on the journey with you. Liz, I was wondering whether you could share with us any exciting partnerships and collaborations that have helped advance your goals at HG&Co.
At HG&Co, we have some old buildings, and we've been doing some work on updating those, including things like fundamentally replacing the whole roof and ensuring that what we put on can take solar panels going forward. We're also part of a local industrial group in our area, and through that we were introduced to an organisation that's a government-funded initiative, non-for-profit, working in the southeast of England, and basically they provided funding to us and worked with us and helped us join with some experts on putting solar panels in place, to talk us through and help us understand what the case would be from a practical making it happen perspective, what the timeline and the steps are, as well as what the costs would be and what the return on investment would be based on our roof and everything else. And that was really good, because we wouldn't have been able to, or taken us longer to do that on our own. So we're now at a point where we can press a button on that project if we want to go ahead.
Thank you for sharing that story with us. Finally, I'd like to wrap up this session, the panel discussion, with a piece of advice from each of you before we then open up the Q&A. So please, audience, get your questions in, anything that is coming to mind. Thank you for the brilliant questions we've got already so far. So from each of you, please, what is your number one piece of advice for any business thinking about embarking on a net zero journey? And maybe Liz, we start with you.
As we touched on previously, I think the people engagement aspect is really important. Fortunately, working for an SME, actually our board was leading this from the top anyway. And when we started to go out and talk to people, what we found is at all levels of the organisation, whether this was guys working on the production floor, whether they were in the laboratory or the office, or they were managers, there were lots of people who were genuinely excited about this as a topic. And one of the ways that we've chosen to harness that is, as a company, we also, no matter whether you work on the shop floor or you're a board director, everybody has personal objectives. And this year we're making sure that within those personal objectives, everybody is being asked to come up with an idea for their department that they can then implement, to get everybody engaged and focused on what we're doing. And that is very exciting for us at the moment.
Thank you. So objectives linked to individuals and engagement through all levels of the business. Fantastic. Francis, what's your number one piece of advice?
It's a little bit dull. It's simply just to engage with your supply chain. For a business like ours, where again 96.5%, there's no materiality within our sort of the emissions that we're in direct control of, other than who we spend our money with. So getting to know those guys really well, working out who is on those journey. There's quite a lot of suppliers that do have targets set now, but also you'll be surprised at the immaturity frequently of your suppliers. And then behind that surprise, you'll be surprised of the unwillingness of some suppliers as well. So I think it's probably worth knowing who they are up front, understanding where your risks are, and then deciding what to do about that.
Thank you very much. And Kate, your number one piece of advice for a business thinking about starting a net zero journey?
I think I agree wholeheartedly with all of those bits. I think if I put myself in maybe a perspective that I don't necessarily always sit in, which is kind of C-suite or board level governance, I think you know, one of the things you have to be prepared for, and this shouldn't be putting people off, but is to have tough conversations about the future of the business. We've touched on degrowth, and I know that's a topic that's come up in the questions. I think a recognition of what you're doing, is your business future-proofed as a result of what you're doing? Are you having a positive impact on the planet as a result of what your business does? And if that, you should be able to square off the conversation about degrowth to some extent, but I think being willing and open to having those quite challenging conversations would be really important from a C-suite perspective.
Thank you. So a vote for courage there. Tough conversations. Thank you very, very much, Francis, Kate, and Liz, for being our wonderful panelists. Next, I'm going to hand back over to Olivia, who's going to open up our Q&A.
Thank you, Inga. Yes, we've got 10 minutes now to as an opportunity for those in our audience to ask questions to our panelists. And, you know, so thank you very much to those who've already been submitting questions. We've had 5 already, which is great. We really appreciate those. And if you have any more questions, please do put them in the chat. If there are any questions we don't have the chance to come to today, we'll still answer them and follow up with you in the coming days. As we enter this Q&A section, it's worth noting that at Seismic, it's really important to us to build a safe space for our community to ask any questions and talk about the challenges they're facing. So as such, we're going to turn the recording off.